So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to Inspire Me today. It's one of our last ones. We've only got two more after this, so it's been an interesting time. Hopefully, you've been getting some good experience both in adaptability and in getting some exposure to things that you haven't experienced before in terms of professional engineering topics and life skills and research, and I'm hoping that we can continue that today. As I said in the email that I sent out earlier, the assignment today, last week I asked you to ask questions and we didn't have a writing assignment. This week I'd like you to do that again, and I'll kind of be keeping track because I would really like people to practice asking questions and asking follow-up questions if you're not quite understanding something, because one of the things that you're going to need to do as you're both learning in school and in a professional environment after school is that you're responsible for your own learning. And if you don't understand something, you need to ask questions until you get it. So I encourage you to ask questions. Dr. Fitzpatrick, I'll turn this over to you so that you can pace it as you want. And I'm sure she's willing to answer any questions and help you understand the incredible work that she does. Dr. Fitzpatrick is an assistant professor who joined us in 2016, so she's coming up on 4 years now with us. And she runs the Computational Biosciences laboratory. And I know she'll explain more about what she does there. And she works with our biomedical engineering PhD, the computing PhD, and what's the other one?
Material science.
And the material science PhD. So she is very familiar with a variety of fields and how her work integrates with that. So Dr. Fitzpatrick, the time is yours.
Great. Thanks, Justin. And just to reiterate, if anyone does have questions along the way, please feel free to stop. Either unmute, ask your question, or else type it into chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that as we go through. So I am going to be talking today about how we can take computational models and use them and apply them to answer questions that are relevant to the clinical and surgical community in biomedical engineering. And so, as Justin briefly mentioned, I started in Boise in 2016. Before that, I am a mechanical engineer by training, so I am Irish, which is where the funny accent comes from. So I did my undergrad and grad school at University College Dublin in Ireland. And the reason that I got into biomedical engineering in the first place was my senior design project. So as part of that project, I got to work with a veterinary surgeon on campus who was over in the veterinary school. And the project was to design a bone plate for dogs that had a fracture. And this was a particular type of fracture where I think you should be able to see my mouth, if not, holler at me, where they had a fracture very low down in the femur, so even lower down than we're shown in this image here actually, so far down here. And so the issue was that there wasn't really any bone below the fracture to rigidly attach a metal plate to hold it in place. You might be able to get a screw or maybe two in here, but it just wasn't very stable, and so the joint wasn't healing very well. And so my job was basically to design a contoured plate that fit to the anatomy of the bone itself. And so you could get, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 screws in that lower section of bone and have a much more stable plating system that actually helped the bone to heal a lot better. And so that was my first experience. And one of the really cool things about that was that I got to follow that project the whole way through. So I got to, study the anatomy, and do a little bit of work on what the design of that plate should be, how we should contour it to match the geometry, the anatomy of the bone itself. Then we also did some mock-ups. We made some rapid prototypes of those components. So we had them, we could touch and feel them and get a sense, more of a tactile sense for how they would fit to the bone. And then the veterinary surgeon that I was working with, he actually got some of those manufactured and started implanting them into dogs during surgery, and sent me x-rays where I could see my design implanted in these dogs. And so he sent me a few of those images. And so that was really cool. Like in the space of, I was working on the project over a year, and the surgery happened about a year after that. So over the space of 2 years, I got to follow that whole process through, from the idea to the design to the manufacturing and implementation to actually seeing the results afterwards in surgery. So that definitely piqued my interest in biomedical engineering and research in general. And so I decided to stay and do my PhD in at UCD also. And so from there, I moved on to look at human needs and address sort of issues with human problems in orthopedics and biomechanics. And so first of all, I did my PhD in Dublin, and then I went over to University of Denver in Colorado and did a postdoc there, which is where I learned a lot of the computational skills that we use in my lab right now. But just kind of a brief intro on the kinds of problems that we're addressing in the knee. So over on the left-hand image here, we have a healthy knee. And so a healthy knee has nice smooth cartilage, which is this white surface right here. And that cartilage is very low friction. So you have this nice surface where the femur, which is that big bone in your thigh, and your tibia, which is the bone in your shin, so that they move really smoothly together. They articulate nicely, low friction. You don't get any rubbing or damage to that tissue. And you also have things like meniscus, which are sort of spongy ring-like structures that help to distribute load over a larger area, so you reduce the contact pressure from the force that's being applied. So what happens to a lot of people later on in life is that they develop osteoarthritis. And so it's about a third of people over 65 will develop osteoarthritis. And so that's this second image here, where we have this, so our cartilage, which was previously all nice and smooth, it has gotten worn away. And so we have these patches where sometimes you wear it away right to the bone, basically. And so cartilage itself is not innervated. It doesn't have a blood supply. So it has no nerves, no blood supply. So when that starts to wear and tear, you don't actually feel it because there's no nerves to tell your brain that damage has been done. But as soon as that wears away and you've got bone contacting on bone on your tibia, you certainly feel that. And so then it becomes a very painful, degenerative condition because it gets worse and worse over time. And so the treatment for that is generally a total knee replacement. Like if it gets bad enough, your surgeon, your orthopedic surgeon will recommend that you get a total knee replacement. There are some sort of intermediate things that you can do along the way. So you might have heard of, some of the stem cell where they're trying to regenerate cartilage, or they're injecting fluid into the joint and those kinds of things. They're not really a long-term solution, or at least not yet anyway. Eventually, if it gets bad enough, a lot of people will require a total knee replacement. And so in the States, I think the number of people needing and getting this surgery is increasing pretty rapidly. So I think we're close to about 1 million of these surgeries being performed per year. So it's a big issue. And so what happens in that surgery is, so here, this image right here, we have our osteoarthritic knee. So we can see a lot of damage to our cartilage. During surgery, the surgeon actually goes in and he or she removes sections of bone. So basically the ends of your femur, the top of your tibia, the surgeon will go in and slice off some of the bone on those articulating surfaces, so those surfaces that are in contact with each other, and replace them with these artificial components, so these metal and plastic components instead. And so that fixes any issues that you have with pain typically, and generally a lot of people get back to having a reasonably a more functional life afterwards. They can do things that were very painful to do before surgery. Having said that, though, there are about 20%, 25% of people that have had this surgery are not satisfied with it. And so they don't necessarily need another surgery, but there's something about the joint, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't move right, that leaves them with either an actual painful joint or just a niggle that, it doesn't feel like their natural needed. And so later on, I'm gonna talk a little bit about one of the studies that we were running to try and help with that. So that's what osteoarthritis is, and the solution is this total knee replacement surgery. And so in my PhD work, I was doing a lot of work to understand the shape of the bone. So one of the things that we deal with in biomedical engineering that you don't see in the aerospace or the automotive industry is that everyone is really variable. And so a person, you compare two people and they'll have different geometry. So that's different anatomy, different bone shape and size. The ligaments, which are these structures that we can see here that are sort of holding your joint in place, they have different mechanical properties. They're attached at different locations. And so everyone is quite different in how they move and how they respond to surgery. And so one of the things I was doing was trying to understand how do we, you can come at it from 2 points of view. One is really subject specific. How do we solve the problem for this particular individual? And the other way to look at it is, if we have this large population, how do we make sure that the things that we're designing are going to be functional across that population and not just for a single person or the average human. So we have a question. So Sawyer is asking that I understand that cartilage loss occurs naturally. Although, is there any way to prevent or minimize this loss with age to prevent knee issues? So that's a great question. So there are some interventions that have had some success, I would say. And so they are things like orthotics, where it's sort of shoe implants where you're changing your alignment to change how the load is distributed across the joint. There are things like even like bracing, again, when you're trying to offload the joint. There are some more invasive surgeries. One is like a tibial osteotomy, which is, so if we have our tibia down here, so that would be this bone right here, they go in and they take out a wedge of bone, like a chunk of bone, and then realign the bone again to change the alignment of the joint and how the joint is loaded. One of the issues with those potential interventions along the way is that we don't necessarily know what's going to work best for a particular individual. And so one of the things that we can do with computational models that I'll kind of loop back around to right at the end of this talk is exactly addressing that question. What are the early intervention things that we can do? And the first one really is how can we figure out who are the people most at risk from developing osteoarthritis in the first place? And so I'll loop back around and mention that briefly at the end of the talk when I'm talking more about some of the future work we have going on. So yes, there are some things that have had success before, but not with everyone. And so it's trying to understand what's going to work best for a particular individual. As I said, or as Justin said, started in 2016. I currently have 5 graduate students that are in 4 different programs. So our mechanical engineering MS program, as well as 3 different PhD programs. So far, we've had 5 master's students graduate from the lab. We have a couple of undergrad students working with us this summer, and so far altogether, we've had 15 undergrad students that have gotten a research experience in the lab. So we have typically have quite a few undergrads helping us out. So if this kind of research is something of interest to you, please let me know. Just with the current state of affairs, we're probably not going to be hiring immediately, but in the fall, next spring, next summer, we're always looking for motivated people to get involved. And so our lab, the main focus is that we're going to use computational models to solve biomechanics problems. And so I'm going to talk about 2 specific projects that have recently finished up in our lab. So the first is looking at that implanted joint, so total knee replacement patients. So this was work done by Kaylin Gibbons. So Kaylin was the first author on this paper that we published earlier this year. The second, and this work was his master's dissertation, and so he has stuck around and he's doing a PhD in my group now, as of last summer. The other study I'm going to talk about is work by Oliver Alvarez. And so Oliver was another master's student in our lab, and so he is first author on this paper over here on the right-hand side, where we were interested in people that had recurrent patellar dislocation. So your patella is your kneecap, so your kneecap kept dislocating, so from the joint. And also, this is kind of cool, but Oliver's paper, one of the figures from his paper was selected to be the cover article for the journal that we submitted it to, so Journal of Orthopedic Research. So that just came out this month. So it was the April 2020 edition. So that was kind of cool to see. So why are we interested in computational models? Well, as I mentioned earlier, with a total knee replacement, surgeon goes in and makes these cuts on the bone. We fit our components to those surfaces, and then all of we end up with something like this over here on the right-hand side, where all those components are assembled together and working ideally harmoniously with one another. But there's a whole lot of potential variability in how we can align them in the joint in the first place, and also the design of the components themselves. So how do we know what's the best design, and how do we fit it in the body so that it's going to perform the best? They're kind of the questions that we're pretty interested in answering when we're thinking about total knee replacement, and the orthopedic industry are quite interested in that question also, as you might expect. So computational models, there are experimental simulators that try to answer those questions also. So this is this is an example of one of them. This one is located at the University of Kansas. This is a cadaveric knee. Probably should have given you a heads up about that. So that would be someone who's donated their body to science. And so we can do things like have a surgeon show up, do a total knee replacement surgery, put it in this machine, and evaluate how it's moving. The trouble with that is that there's a limited number of designs we can assess in that sort of a setup. You obviously need a cadaver, which are expensive. You need a surgeon to show up and do the surgery. You need a whole team of people in the lab collecting all that data and processing it, and prepping the joint, all that kind of stuff. Computational models we can use as a complement to those experiments, where instead of running maybe 3 or 5 or maybe 10 experiments, we can use our computational model to evaluate hundreds or maybe even thousands of different designs, different iterations. And so these are very much complementary tools, because we need the experimental data to help us validate our models, but then we can use the models to answer questions that are really challenging to answer in any other way, just because of either the resources or the availability required to do that. And so here's sort of a kind of a cool representation of the computational counterpart over here on the right-hand side to the actual physical experiment over on the left-hand side. And so this is just an animation, obviously, but we put a lot of effort into demonstrating that we have the data to back it up, that our computational model is validated. And so it's giving us, an answer that's comparable to what we would get if we did that exact same experiment in the physical simulator. So we can develop this really nice tool set that helps us to answer some of these questions. And so here's a couple of other sort of animations from projects that have been going on in our labs. These were both master's students that graduated over the last year or so. So this was Adele's. She was looking at patients with crouch gait, and Erica, who was looking at actually the same population, but more at the joint level than the lower limb level over here. So you can have a whole different range of really an infinite range of the type of computational model that's going to be that you can develop, and that sort of depends on the questions that you're trying to answer. And so for some of the advantages, I guess, is that computational models are relatively cheap. We can parameterize them pretty easily, so that means we can go in and change things, so geometry, loading conditions, and material properties, but there are still some limitations, obviously. It requires it still requires a considerable amount of time, both to set up the models in the first place and also computational time to run those simulations. And then expertise, you obviously need to have someone who knows how to develop these models, and goes through all those validation steps. So in our first study, the objective was to develop a statistical shape function model that would replace our computational simulations. And so this is to address that question of, okay, we need expertise to set up these models. We have to run, maybe we need to run 1,000 simulations. Each simulation takes an hour. That's a decent chunk of work and effort to do that. So what we were trying to figure out here was, could we develop basically an analytical model, a mathematical model that we could get an instantaneous answer. So we could change our parameters, so we could change design parameters, change alignment parameters, click a button and get an instantaneous response, so within a second, basically. And so that was our question. Can we substitute these computational models with something that's a lot faster? So the way we did this was, we started with a computational model. So this was a finite element model. And we have our bone in here. We have our components. So we also have some muscles and ligaments surrounding the joint. And so this came from a combination of experimental data and literature. And we started with this initial model. And we have one more question. So Cody is asking, many computations require powerful computers. Do these computational models require specialized computer arrays to function? Would the computer requirements be a barrier to entry for someone, or is that not much of an issue? It depends on the model itself. So most of our models, actually, you can run on a standard PC. They might take a little bit longer depending on your PC specs. Others are longer running, like they might take multiple days to run, and so for that we typically transfer them over to the computing cluster that we have on campus here. But the vast majority of them we can run on our local PCs, and it does just fine. But again, it's very much dependent on the computing power that you have available to you. We get nice computers in our lab. I will say that we get pretty legit computers, so that we do have that speed to back it up. So this model, for example, would run easily on any of your PCs or laptops even. It's a pretty efficient little model, and we developed it particularly because we did want it to be able to run within half an hour, because we're planning on doing hundreds and hundreds of different simulations. So we have our model set up. So we have bone, these are the components in there. They're parameterized, so it's sort of a stylized representation of the real components, but it has all the basic geometry requirements. And so it looks, so this is our simulation running. So we have, we're just doing a squat cycle. So starting from a person standing where they bend down, and so their femur is flexing by about 120 degrees or so. So that's our basic model, but then we want to be able to change things in that model. So change the design of our components, change how it's aligned in the knee, and still be able to look at things like the joint mechanics, the kinematics. So what are the stress, what are the contact pressures, the contact areas, the force in the joint, and the kinematics, how's it moving? That's also quite important. So the design parameters that we decided to include in this study, I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but basically we were looking at different conformities between our femur and our condyle. So like the curvature of these components, in the femur, in the radius, in the tibial components down here. So these were all the values that we're going to change in our model. So we're going to go in and modify those values and rerun a simulation with those new values. Similarly, we looked at alignment parameters, so that's how those components are going to be fixed relative to the bone themselves. So this, for example, again, I'm not going to go through them in any detail, but so this one is the valgus varus alignment. So that's if you were looking at someone, it would be the difference between someone that's bow-legged and knock-kneed. It's that alignment condition. So we can go in and change how our component is sitting in the bone. Like you can see that we could take this, we could rotate it by a few degrees and sort of straighten it up and change how it's sitting in the bone. So they were the things that we're interested in changing. And that was driven by what surgeons do and the sort of the variability that a surgeon has in deciding where to put that. We wanted to see, well, what effect does that actually have on the joint? So here is a couple of examples of, two different, the exact same model, same loading boundary conditions, but we have two different models where we're changing some of those design and alignment parameters. And so hopefully you can see here the difference between these two. There's quite different contact pressures, contact areas between those two, and even might not be totally obvious here, even the kinematics, so how the joint is moving. And so we have another question from Tariq. Given that everyone has slightly different muscular and bone structure, how is size of the bone and strength of the muscles and tendons chosen in these computations? Also, are they scalable to account for different sizes? So that is another great question. A lot of our, not specifically this study, but in the next study that I talk about, we do a better job of accounting for some of those patient-specific factors. And sometimes we're taking actual patient geometry from MRI, medical imaging scans, and reconstructing the geometry for that individual so it represents their size and shape. For this one, we actually just had we took a generic size and sort of eliminated that as a potential error, or a potential source of variability. We could take this study and expand it out so that we looked at the full range of sizes across the population. But this was a simpler version of that. Your question about slightly different muscle and tendons is actually really is a pretty hard question to answer, actually, because that is one of those things that it is not, we can't tell just from a scan or from non-invasive procedures, things like the mechanical properties of a tendon or a ligament. And so we use a lot of cadaveric studies in conjunction with mechanical testing to get a better idea of the properties of those materials. But then in our models, we do have to use some generic properties. And so there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that because we've just plugged in values over here and we don't know if they're a good fit for that person. So in a lot of our other studies, we didn't include it in this one, but in a lot of our other studies, we actually include a probabilistic analysis of those soft tissue parameters. So instead of just giving it a single value that we've taken from cadaveric experiments, we give it a range of potential values that it could have, and we run multiple simulations. So maybe hundreds of simulations where those parameters are constantly changed. And then instead of getting a single answer for, in the simulations we have here, for each one of these models, we can extract out a contact pressure and a contact area profile, and we'll look at them a little bit later on. But for a probabilistic simulation, we have not a single answer, but we have a bounds of performance. Like we can say with pretty good certainty that the answer is going to lie somewhere in this range. We don't know for sure because we don't have enough information about those soft tissues, but we can say it's somewhere in a range. So hopefully that somewhat answers your question. So from our simulation, we can run different combinations of design and line parameters and extract out these different joint mechanics outputs. And so the way we sampled that, like if we tried to run every single possible combination. That's an infinite number of things, basically, which we can't do. So we'd use a little bit of strategery in deciding what combinations of parameters we'll combine together. And so this is, you can think of a certain either this chessboard grid style, or Sudoku is actually not a bad model to use for how we do some of this sampling. But in this example, we would just have two factors. So factor 1, factor 2, and we sample so that we have an even distribution across all of our space. In reality, we probably rarely have two factors in the simulations that we're running in this simulation. We had a handful of design parameters, a handful of surgical parameters, and so we ended up with about a dozen different parameters. So if you can think in 12-dimensional space, you're doing better than me anyway. But that's essentially what we're doing. We're trying to have this even distribution of samples between those factors, regardless of the quadrant or the section that you're looking in. And so the method that we used was Latin hypercube sampling, is what that was called. But there's a whole different spectrum of algorithms. So basically, what we did was we ran a handful of a few dozen different surgical different trials. So we tried two different levels. So a reduced level where we ran 60, or a more intensive level where we ran 120. And we did the same for design, and a combination where we were changing both of these things in a model simultaneously. And then what we did was we developed all we used actually for the prediction part to see how well our model could predict it was just simple linear regression. And then we also tried quadratic plus interaction terms in that regression equation. So that the actual predictive algorithm that we were using was pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And we'll see how well it worked in a second. So here we wanted to be able to quantify how well our model was working. So we had for each set of design and alignment parameters, we had run each of that combination in our finite element simulation. So we had sort of the actual answer from our FE, and then we used our predictive model to get the instantaneous answer by just giving it those same handful of parameters. And then to compare them to the two of them, we used an error between those, calculated an error, root mean squared error between those two outputs. So the solid line there is what our instantaneous model predicted, and the dashed line is what our finite element analysis answer was. And the difference between them is the FE simulation took about 30 or so minutes to run. The prediction was instantaneous. We got that answer in sub millimeter. And so to verify that our model was doing well, we ran an additional set of 100 randomly generated set of parameters, both in the FE world and in our instantaneous model prediction, and compared those values to make sure that we were with an unbiased set of parameters. We were doing a pretty good job. And so here are some of the results between them. So each color that we're seeing here is one particular set of parameters. So we have the solid lines are our instantaneous predictions, the dashed lines are our FE, and these shaded bounds in the background are just the range that all our data sat within. So we can see we're doing a pretty good job of matching our FE results, and also it's doing it, regardless of where in this space we're doing it. And so I've just shown a random selection of 4, but we're seeing equivalently good results across all those 100 trials that we ran to test. And we saw this, so this was kinematics, so how the joint moves, and this was joint loads. So what are some of the mechanics of the joint itself? And similarly, we're getting some pretty decent answers. So this is sort of a summary of all the results. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but it's just to say that regardless, when we were looking at combining design and surgical parameters together, with our linear regression model, our errors were below 20%. if we use some different fancier model predictions, they reduced a little bit. And if we looked at just surgical parameters on their own, our errors came down to about 5%. But in general, 20% errors, less than 20% errors, 15 to 20% is actually pretty decent given the time savings from those models. Because it means that, so we get this instantaneous prediction, which means that we can take this and we can apply it in a design pipeline. So if you're trying to design a new total joint replacement, instead of having to iterate either experimentally or even computationally in a finite element simulation that might take multiple days or weeks to run all of those simulations, we can do that in a matter of minutes. If each one of those simulations is taking less than a second, we can run thousands of different combinations. And we can also use it as a tool to optimize that design. How do we design that component so that we get this particular output that we're interested in? You can actually set it up in that sort of a way. So you can say, okay, well, I want my kinematics to move like this. I will optimize my design so that I get that outcome. And because it's so fast, you're actually able to do that. So that's a sort of a really nice pipeline to translating some of this computational work into something that's more relevant to industry and potentially even to clinicians. So that's the first kind of a quick summary of that first study on total knee replacement. I'll stop for a minute and see, does anyone have any other questions on that for the moment? Okay. I'll move on to the second study. So this is, sorry about the ow factor in the animation. But this is, so the study that I want to talk about was looking at patellar dislocation. And so this is typically a sports-related injury. So this poor unfortunate gentleman down here has dislocated his patella. So it is not sitting where it's supposed to be. As you can tell, it's quite a painful injury. In the States, there's about 20,000 of these per year, and about 50% of those patients go on to suffer from recurrent dislocation, where it happens again, and multiple times. And so again, why are computational models relevant or useful? Well, there are a few different types of treatment options that surgeons will advise or physicians will advise for this kind of injury. The first is just physical therapy. You do some muscle strengthening over here. You can also do more invasive surgical interventions where you go in and adjust some of the soft tissues in the joint. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. Or you can go in and actually modify your bony anatomy. So there's a whole sort of spectrum of different treatment options. But the question is, well, what's going to work best for a particular individual? And so there are, again, because the population is so variable, there are a lot of, everyone is different, and everyone has different anatomy. And some of your anatomic factors will make you more or less will put you at higher or lower risk of dislocating your patella. So one of them is, it's called patella alta baja, I should say, where your patella can either sit up very high on your femur or very down low or anywhere in between. So it's basically the length of this little ligament down here, your patellar tendon. And so people that have a patella that sits up very high, it's actually easier to dislocate because further down here, the geometry of your femur actually provides a nice little groove that the patella sits in. And so once it's in that groove, it has some bony restraint, and so it's harder to push it out of that groove essentially. But if it's sitting up really high up here, it doesn't have that groove, and so it's basically sitting on a fairly flat bone, and so it's much easier to push out of its happy alignment position. So that's patella alta baja over there. Another one is the groove itself that I just mentioned. So normally the patella would be sitting in this groove, but the shape of that groove also varies from person to person. So you can have a nice deep groove, like something like that. that provides a lot of constraint, bony constraint here and here, or you can have something that's a lot flatter. And so hopefully you can see that if you have a patella sitting here, it's going to be much easier to push it out of that groove, because the groove itself it doesn't really exist. It's not providing any constraint. And then there's also some other alignment issues, so if you have this is just the alignment of your lower limb, basically. If you have an alignment that's sort of more over here, so this, I'm looking at this angle right here. If you have an angle like this, your muscles are essentially pulling your patella in this direction, pulling it to the outside of your knee. And so those people it is easier for those people to dislocate their patella because you have the muscles actually doing some of the work to pull it out of the groove. So there was another question on how materials are chosen or decided when designing a specific product. And so that would probably be more relevant to the total knee replacement. Is geometry, I think, is probably what you're referring to. Well, that is, they have to be biocompatible and they have to be low wear. And so a lot of material science has actually gone into designing those components. The best combination that we typically see is a titanium or a cobalt chrome femoral component. So that would be the metal component is sitting on a polyethylene, ultra high molecular weight polyethylene component, because that gives you a really low friction. So friction comparable to the coefficient friction that you see in the natural healthy joint. So there's some other anatomic factors that also do the same thing, like they align the muscles so that it's easier to pull the patella out of the joint. And so there's a standard treatment protocol, which is to send someone to PT. If they're still dislocating, maybe they're a candidate for surgery where you reconstruct a particular ligament that I'll talk about a little bit later on. Or you can do this sort of bone adjustment surgery. So that's kind of the ABC. You know, they go in sequence to try and address, to try and correct that dislocation problem. But a lot of the times surgeons aren't accounting for subject-specific anatomic factors. You know, they're going through this process, physical therapy, ligament reconstruction, tibial tubercle medial transfer, without actually saying, is this surgery actually addressing these underlying anatomic conditions? And so for our research question, we were interested in, well, what is the optimal treatment for a particular individual? And so again, we used finite element simulations to predict what the outcomes of those surgeries would be. And so we looked at a few different surgeries. So a trochleoplasty is where you go in, and I was talking about the kind of the flat anatomy over here on the femur. The surgeon goes in and actually makes the groove. So they go in, they take out a chunk of bone to create a little groove for the patella to sit into. Or they go in and they modify a tibial tubercle osteotomy. You go in and you modify the tubercle, which is where your patellar ligament is attached to. And again, that's just changing the line of action of that ligament, and so changing the line of action of the muscle, like the quadriceps muscle, which is that big muscle in your lower leg or in your thigh. And then the last one that they do quite a lot is this ligament reconstruction surgery, where typically when you dislocate your patella, that ligament is ruptured in 90 to 95% of the time. That ligament is ruptured. And so if you see down here, if we were applying a little load here, most people dislocate their patellas laterally, so to the outside of the body. So it would be, you'd have an external force or something like that, like maybe you get hit or you land funny. And so you have this force pushing on your patella. The first time that happens, you typically rupture that ligament. And then, so one surgery that's used pretty commonly is they go in and they repair that ligament. So try and reattach it, or use a graft is actually what they mostly do. So that was this ligament right here, the medial patellofemoral ligament. But a lot of times people are doing this surgery without accounting for any of the other factors. So the alta-baja position, or the groove, the depth of that femoral groove. So in our study, we were just comparing all of the different potential surgical options. So we have preoperative, where that ligament has been ruptured already, a restorative procedure where we're just reconstructing the MPFL, a tibial tubercle osteotomy where we're moving that osteotomy of that where our patellar tendon is attached, to where we're fully correcting all abnormal factors. So we measure all of those factors, abnormal factors in a person, and then we do whatever surgery is required, like that trochleoplasty or the ligament reconstruction, to restore them all to normal. And then we also had a version of that where we don't do the most invasive surgery. We're basically trying to find out what is the least amount of things that we can do that will give us the best answer. And then we also compare them to equivalent healthy control subjects. And so our data came from a collaborator who's actually in Ohio. We had data from almost 30 subjects, and the data was just MRI scans, so medical imaging scans. We developed a model which is kind of similar to that model we were using in the previous study, except that this is all patient-specific anatomy. So each one of these geometries is reconstructed from that individual's MRI scan, and we obviously it's the natural knee joint as well, so we don't have any of the artificial components in there. And this was all based on experimental data, so it's an older study, experimental study. We also developed some tools where we could morph the geometry of the joint. So I was talking about changing this groove. So we went in and were able to morph the shape of that groove in an automated way. So you basically change the number of this angle and instantaneously generate a model with that new geometry representation. And so here's sort of the comparison. So this was our initial simulation where that person is very susceptible to dislocation. Then we run the same simulation with the updated anatomy, soft tissues, all that kind of stuff. So where we've implemented that virtual surgery, and then we can compare how does that do under those same loading conditions. And so the metrics that we're looking at is how much does the patella move, basically, how much does it rotate, how much does it translate, and what is the amount of force being generated in this little ligament here. And so really this was just a comparison of all that data, and you can see here that the pre-operative where we haven't done anything, where the person has ruptured their MPFL, is obviously quite a bit worse. So basically higher numbers means there's more motion, and so this person is dislocating basically. And this is I should say the average and standard deviation of our population. So just in conclusion, just to get to the crux of it, from the study we were able to efficiently generate new subject-specific models. We could evaluate different surgical combinations across our population data set, and then in the future, we want to be able to package all of this data into a set of clinical guidelines that would be based on simple anatomic measurements that would be useful to the surgeon. And so I'm just going to spend like a minute, because I think we're close on time, just looking ahead to so there were two studies that we completed over the last year or so. Over the next probably 5 or more years, this sort of feeds into the first question that came up earlier, was, what do we do before people need a total knee replacement? And so are there things that we can do to help detect the people that are going to be susceptible to osteoarthritis later in life, and then be able to intervene at that point? And so we've just started a study to address that, basically. And so what we want to do is go from patient-specific medical images, so MRI data, all the way through to where we can develop an actual interactive tool that surgeons can use to inform their decision-making process. And so basically the steps, I'll summarize them here a little bit, are step one is we have this medical imaging over here, which is basically just a bunch of slices. Can we create 3D models efficiently from those slices? So sorry. And so we have Kaylin, actually, who's one of the students that ran that first study, was the lead author on that first study. For his PhD work, he's going to be working quite a bit on this automated procedure. So can we go from those images to an actual 3D model? And so we've started this pretty recently, but it's actually been going quite well. So like this is an example of one of his recent animations where we start from a pretty coarse scan where we've developed some neural network algorithms to help reconstruct that into slices, and then go through a smoothing procedure where we can create pretty decent looking geometries, so of bone and cartilage in an automated way from those scans. This will ignore this giant hole in the patella that is not entirely physiologically accurate. But so far, some of the early results that we're getting are actually doing a pretty nice job with that data. So from that, we want to essentially run the same instantaneous study that we ran previously, the natural knee instead of the implanted knee, so we can eliminate FE, the finite element component of that analysis, and be able to instantly generate joint mechanics predictions from a scan, from an MRI image. And then one of the other objectives is to combine all of that mechanical information that we can get from our finite element analysis with information about the structure, so the anatomy of the joint, as well as some of the biological components. And so I just had a PhD student start this semester. So Vahid, who's I think in the meeting, he's going to be looking at how these different factors are related both to one another and also to how osteoarthritis is progressing. And then the last is, we're not quite there yet, but is to develop an interactive platform that we could use to talk to clinicians to explain osteoarthritis. So that is all I wanted to talk to you about today. I want to obviously thank all of the students who've worked on this. So that's Kaylin and Oliver in particular, and Donovan Wright was actually an undergrad student, a CS undergrad student. So he did a lot of the early work on that neural network automated procedure. We also are working with some collaborators at the University of Denver, and we have funding from NSF and NIH. And so this is my lab website. If anyone is interested either in an undergrad position or potentially even a grad position later on, feel free to reach out and chat. I'd be happy to talk with you. So, all right, that was slightly longer than I had intended, Justin. I apologize, but I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Claire. And let's take a moment. I know there are some people who have been thinking of questions that they'd like to ask and didn't feel like they got a chance yet. So let's open it up for questions, guys.
What do your studies look like right now for your lab with everything going on?
It hasn't slowed us down too much. Actually, everyone has moved off campus, so they're VPNing into campus resources. Some people have actually took their PCs home with them and have gotten set up there. Other people are just accessing remotely, so not too bad because we're so computational. Being physically present on campus is not as big an issue for us as it is for some other groups.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. Thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick. This has been really great, and I love hearing about your work whenever you talk about it. And I look forward to interacting more with everybody in our next session and seeing more of your reactions to this seminar.
Yeah, and thank you all for the great questions. It was they're pretty insightful, so I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, guys.